Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Amico. I am the Vice President for the Education Committee at Buffalo Niagara Sales and Marketing Executives. So excited for the first session of today after an amazing day yesterday of speakers. So today we have Lisa Ettipio presenting interview do's and don'ts. She's the Healthcare Operations Manager and Facility Administrator at DaVita Kidney Care, and she has so many amazing things to talk about. So I will hand it right over.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Like Lindsay said, my name is Lisa. If you do have any questions, please feel free to either raise your hand or put your question in the chat box, and we'll be able to answer all questions either during or at the end of the presentation. All right, so we're going to start off today by talking about interviewing practices, the do's and don'ts. So we're also going to first and foremost start with preparing for a virtual interview. In today's day and age, there are so many preliminary steps that we take, and in most cases, it can start with a phone interview or a virtual interview. So it's very important to make sure that you prepare for those the same way that you would prepare for a face-to-face interview. So some key things to keep in mind when preparing is you want to make sure that you double check the time zone because you might be interviewing with a potential employer that is in another time zone. So it's very important to make sure that you show up on time and are not late. Making sure that you can be found easily, checking your privacy settings so that the interviewer can find and contact you easily. And of course, to avoid confusion, making sure that you know who's going to be contacting whom, whether you're clicking into a link or if it's a telephone interview, which party will be calling the other. And of course, having a backup plan for if some reason there's a problem from a technological perspective that arises, agreeing on an alternative such as a phone interview. We always also want to make sure that our online presence overall is professional, making sure that we have a profile picture that's appropriate. It's always best to use one like that's in the form of a headshot where a headshot where you are by yourself. You also want to make sure that your profile name is appropriate as well. You have an example here of Sexy Sharon 69. So we want to make sure that we have something that's professional, like your first and last name. We also want to make sure that before the call occurs, that you have your profile is correct, that you are presentable, and any contact information has been exchanged, as well as any status activity from an online perspective is set to available so that the interviewer does not think that you are busy. The other piece to the puzzle, as far as technical aspects are concerned, you always want to make sure you double check which platform that the interview will be taking place on and download it ahead of time. Some of the most common virtual platforms for video meetings include, but are not limited to, Skype or Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Google Hangouts, Slack, and GoToMeetings. Virtual interview tools require the camera and the microphone, so you always want to test your computer ahead of time. And make sure that you do have a reliable internet connection. That's always going to be key. You always want to make sure you test it anywhere between 15 to 30 minutes before your interview to make sure that everything's in working order. And you also may want to use a headset instead of using the microphone on the computer, so you'll have the ability to have a better connection from a voice as well as hearing perspective. Professional appearance is also very important. You should always dress for a virtual interview the same way you would dress for one face-to-face. Doing so not only makes you appear professional and excited about the opportunity, but it makes you feel more prepared and confident. Just because an interview is taking place from a remote location like your home, you should expect it to be just as formal as one that takes place in an office. We always like to make sure that I apologize, I lost my train of thought there. Because you're interviewing via video or phone, it does limit the ability for the prospective employer to view your body language. So it's very important to make sure that you're utilizing, utilizing your body language in a clear, professional way. For example, if you get a question that's unexpected, make sure that you stay poised and take a moment to collect your thoughts. You want to make sure that you're sitting up straight, that your camera is placed so that your face is in the middle of the screen. You don't want to have too much space above you or have it angled. So there's been times where I've had interviews with candidates and they've had it angled where you're literally looking up the person's nose. So you want to make sure that your face is centered in the screen. In most interviews, you normally would shake hands in a face-to-face situation. So you always want to make sure that you are greeting the prospective interviewer with, enthusiasm. You're smiling, making sure that you have a confident wave, making sure you're making eye contact. Environment is also another key factor when you're looking at it, working in a virtual setting. You want to make sure that you're setting the stage for a successful interview. So really make sure that you can avoid distractions. So the best place to take an interview in your home is in a quiet location. So you want to choose a room that's clean and professional looking so the interviewer can really focus their attention on you and not what's around you. If you don't have a dedicated office space, you can use the bedroom or guest room or even your kitchen table, as long as what's behind you is a clear space. You want to make sure that your desk or tabletop versus being on a couch. You also want to make sure, if you are sharing space with other people in your home, that let them know the time of your interview and that you do require a quiet space during that particular time, and explain that we want to try to, to your partner or to your roommates, that you want to be able to limit the distractions. Also, if there are any pets in the home, you want to make sure that they might be in a separate room so that they're not jumping up and getting on camera. I'm a firm believer in making sure you're prepared for your interview. So you always want to make sure that you prepare in advance, making sure you have a copy of your resume in front of you for reference, any notes that you would have taken on the research you would have done for the company, as well as, maybe of some pre-written answers to some common questions that are asked. It's always nice to have some bullet points prepared of why you'd be a good fit for the position based off of what the job description was. You also want to make sure that you planned a well-timed follow-up. It's a good practice to follow up with an email within 24 hours of the interview, thanking the interviewer for their time. If it's a virtual interview, it's absolutely acceptable to email versus sending a handwritten thank you note. So if you are dealing with HR, it's okay to contact them versus the interview. If you don't happen to have the interviewer's email, so you can reach out to human resources and they'd be able to either forward your thank you to the interviewer or provide you with that information. Okay. Moving along. So there are a lot of different questions to consider when responding to questions that are being asked, whether you're face-to-face or in a virtual setting or even over the phone. One of the most common questions that comes up is, tell me about yourself. And this is where you can really differentiate yourself from the masses of people that are being interviewed. You want to think about things and situations where you've created efficiencies, what motivates you, how you stand out from the competition, maybe providing an example of a problem that you've solved, a time when you've met or exceeded expectations or goals, what direction you're looking to take your career, what skills you have, the skills that you have to offer. And if you belong to any organizations, it's always good to mention those because you never know, you develop skills and experiences through all facets of your life. So when you're thinking about skills and strengths, people forget the experiences that they've developed through various groups, whether it's a volunteer opportunity, a sports club, a church group, scouts. There are so many different skills that we've developed. If you belong to a sporting team, you develop leadership skills, teamwork, those type of things that people tend to forget about. Another common question that does come up are strengths. So it's always good to think about this ahead of time. Some of the common strengths that employers are looking for in candidates deal with time management, communication, prioritization, and organization, as well as computer literacy. There are a few other things that there's a lot of other skills that organizations look for, especially strengths from a business perspective could deal with how you work through policy and procedure, managing inventory or planning events, making sure that you know how to plan and analyze, whether it be implementing a procedure or analyzing data. There's projects that people have done within a school setting or even in a work setting where they can really leverage these skills. if they've had to manage others, whether it be in a focus group at school or a study group, or it could be obviously in a business setting as well. And being able to sell yourself and really be able to highlight the key skills that you have to offer and what makes you stand out. Another common question that does come up is, what is your biggest weakness? For this question, a lot of people struggle with it, coming up with a good, solid answer. You want to make sure that you identify an area that you'd like to gain more experience in. You also want to make sure that it's not an item that's an essential duty of the position that you're interviewing for. And you also want to make sure that you include how you're working on improving in this area. Some of these common examples of areas that people like to work on are communication skills. It could be leadership, delegating tasks, accepting or providing constructive criticism. And there's a lot of different ways to present that information. Could be something as simple as, having trouble saying no. A lot of times individuals have that. And when they run into that situation, my recommendation is to, talk through it from the standpoint of, my greatest weakness is sometimes I have trouble saying no, and, to request and sometimes take on more than I can handle. And in the past, that has led me to feel stressed out or burned out, or stressed or burned out. But to help myself improve on this area, I've, utilized a project management app so I can visualize how much work needs to be done and how much time needs to be given to each task, so that I know if I have bandwidth or not to take on that opportunity or that project. So it's being able to really break it into those three key components. Another example would be trouble asking for help. And, or maybe if someone provides you with a project and you need to ask for additional directions, so uncomfortable with ambiguity. So those are some key areas that a lot of individuals tend to struggle with being able, and those are great examples of things that you can say where you'd like to gain more experience and what you're doing to really improve in those areas. Another question that does come up is, why should I hire you? And when answering these questions, a prospective employer is really looking to see you leverage your skills and strengths that are related to the position, how you can help them overcome their pain points, address their future goals for the company or their department specifically. And when you're talking with the prospective employer during the interview and leveraging the skills and strengths that you have for these pain points, you're demonstrating your listening skills. And these are the key components that you should really leverage when crafting your answer. What you don't want to say is, well, I really need this job, or, I heard the company offers great pay and benefits. Though, yes, they may do that. You want to make sure that you're providing them and highlighting why you'd really be a good fit for the role with the strengths and skills that you have. Ultimately, how you can make their life easier and achieve the goals that the company has for that position or department or overall for the company. There's a few key items that I always like to bring up, or they're the common nonverbal mistakes that are made during a job interview. And, these are things that most people don't even realize are being looked at. There was a survey that was given to over 2,000 managers across various industries, and 33% claimed to know within 90 seconds of an interview, if they were interested in hiring the person that they were interviewing or not. And when meeting new people, it's very interesting to see, how things are impacted. For example, clothing. 70% of employers claim that they don't want applicants that are too fashionable or trendy, where 65% of bosses said that clothes could be the deciding factor between two similar candidates, which really speaks to the importance of professional appearance. Following the statistics, if you take a look around, we take a look at the left side, they look 21% of candidates touch their hair or their face during their interview. 47% have little or no knowledge about the company. And it's a very common mistake made during an interview, is that they're not prepared with what the company does, what products they sell. Failure to make eye contact. 67% of candidates during the interview process are not making eye contact. And that is something that is so important to a prospective employer. Forgetting to smile, 38%, bad posture is about 33%. Using too many hand gestures is at 9%. And I'm someone who definitely uses their hands a lot when they speak. And you want to be yourself in an interview, and it's okay to use some hand gestures. You just don't want to be over the top. When you're in a face-to-face situation, making sure that when you have a handshake, when you're shaking someone's hand, making sure that it's a nice firm handshake, not too strong, not too weak. You don't want to have that dead fish, where it's just kind of hanging there, but you also don't want to be crushing somebody's hand either. So it's really finding that delicate balance between the two. And, many of these things we do subconsciously. That's why it's so important to practice, ask a friend or family member to role play with you, practice, your answers in front of the mirror. This way, what you look like when you're answering a question. There's many times that people don't realize that when they're thinking, they make a certain face or they might look off to the side. So it's always good to make sure to practice with someone so they can provide feedback. And then this way it makes you more prepared when you are working with that individual. There are a variety of behavioral questions that do get asked during the interview process. And they fall into a couple of different categories: time management, adaptability, overcoming challenges, motivation, communication, teamwork, and conflict resolution. And there's a variety of different ways that these questions can be asked. But when you're addressing these questions, it's great to use what we call the STAR method. And what STAR stands for is defining the situation, setting the task or target of what you're looking to achieve, the actions that you took to address the situation, and then overall what the end result was. And when you can address the behavioral questions by leveraging this method, it allows you to give very succinct, specific answers to the question at hand. Recommendations. As far as when you're addressing the questions, you want to keep your STAR story or your STAR answer anywhere between 1 to 3 minutes. So you want it to be succinct. You want to emphasize what's measurable from a results perspective, and add statements to reinforce the message. It was hard, but we worked through it. Or we achieved our goal, something to that effect. And most importantly, you want to make sure that your story is tied back to character traits that the interviewer is looking for, whether it's dedication or teamwork. Another question that comes up that a lot of people do struggle with is the salary question. And no one really likes to answer this question, right? It's always uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of people if you're not prepared. And making sure you do the research so that you know what the position pays. And there's a very simple, what is the best way to answer this question? Well, first and foremost, I have 2 different resources here on screen. onetonline.org and bls.gov are 2 great sites that provide a lot of information. You can search by position, you can search by industry. It allows you to put in a zip code, so you can really narrow it down to your key focus areas. There's a lot of different factors that come into play when looking at salaries: size of company, industry, years of experience, location. So there's a lot of factors that do come into that. So when this question does come up, especially if it's in the beginning of the conversation, I always try to recommend to divert that question to a little bit later on. And what you can say is that's a fair question, but what I was making might be like comparing apples to oranges. We have yet to determine, what it is that I can do for you. So let's not cloud our ongoing conversation by throwing out a dollar amount. Money is the easy part. We can always negotiate that later. Or you can even talk about, let's discuss the position further so I can provide you with, a fair range. Or you can even turn that around. If the question comes up at the end of the conversation, you can ask, is there a certain salary range that they were looking at? Because obviously we always anticipate that they expect a salary that's consistent with, what current employees are making at the same level. And you always want to stress that you can be an asset to the company. And obviously if you match, an offer is accepted, and then you can move forward. There's a lot of times where, they are looking for a direct answer as far as a specific dollar amount. In that instance, especially when it's after you've discussed the position and you know what the responsibilities are, that's where it's always great to provide a range, and you want to keep it within probably about a $10,000 range between the low end of your range and the high end of the range. And obviously it's based on experience and the comfort range of where you'd like to be. So it's really about marrying all of those key factors of having the knowledge and doing the research ahead of time. One of the other comments that does come up when you're talking through an interview is, why did you leave your last position, or why do you plan on leaving? And this is something, there's a lot of different ways to answer this question. And I really recommend, being able to position yourself to talk about looking at development opportunities for yourself, growth opportunities. Maybe you return to school to continue your degree program, or maybe you had to resign due to a family issue. There's a lot of different, situations where, a position might have been eliminated and someone could have been laid off. So you want to be honest, but really kind of make sure that you're prepared to answer the question of, maybe it's work-life balance. There's a lot of different components and very positive reasons why people are looking to make a career change. You never want to say anything negative about a current or past employer. You always want to make sure that you keep things in a positive light and look for, like I said, the growth opportunities or work-life balance opportunities when answering those questions. Another interesting question that has come up from time to time is, how do you deal with stress? And when an interviewer asks this question, they really want to know how you can handle job-related stress, what you do in particular stressful work situations. This is especially important if you're interviewing for a position where stress is an integral part of the job, because sometimes it can have a negative impact on workplace performance. So the hiring manager is going to be wondering, what you do to, how it might impact your performance, how you deal with stressful situations, whether it's personal or work related. And to answer this question successfully, you really want to provide a specific example of how you handled stress well in the past, providing an example of a time, when you were under pressure and what you did to be more productive in working through it. And for an example of that could be, pressure is very important to me. Good pressure, such as having assignments or upcoming deadlines, helps me stay motivated and productive. Obviously, there are times where, you might have too much pressure that can lead to stress, but I feel that I'm very balanced in, working on multiple projects and meeting deadlines. And this allows me the ability to not feel overly stressed. And you could provide it, if you had an example where you might have had multiple projects due in the same week, and how you set the timeline of what time was going to be dedicated to each one to make sure that maybe small goals were achieved before moving on to the next one. Another question that does come up is, how do you deal with difficult people? When this, there's all different personalities that make up our workforce, right? So when you're looking at the different personality types that could be in a potential workplace, whether it's dealing with someone who might be challenging or difficult, or even in some cases annoying, they come in all varieties. And unfortunately, we need to make sure that we consider everyone when looking at, pressures in the workplace. There's different things that irritate other people. So it's really just about being upfront and keeping it simple, showing that you're not bothered by the small things and demonstrating your ability to be patient with the people that you're working with. An example of a situation that you might be frustrated or encounter dealing with someone difficult might be if someone else took credit for your work, or if someone maybe missed a deadline as part of a team project. And it's really just kind of keeping in mind that, obviously there are times where there are legitimate grievances, and there's a difference between that and a personal pet peeve. So for example, if someone missed a deadline, you could say, I'm bothered by, I'm bothered by big mistakes or problems that have a team impact. For example, if a coworker were to miss a deadline on an important project, obviously that's not fair to the other people in the group that had made their deadlines. So it's, also mentioning how you would work with that individual to help them meet their deadline as well. That leads us to wrapping up an interview. There are a couple of key things that you want to make sure that we talk about when it comes to wrapping up an interview. You want to make sure to have a set of questions to ask the interviewer. I think it's very important to have those. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. You always want to restate your interest in the position, summarize why you're the best candidate, find out what the next steps are, and of course, thank the interviewer and ask them for their business card. By asking for their business card, it allows you to have, especially in a face-to-face situation, it allows you to be able to have their contact information so you can call to follow up, send a thank you note, or whether it be a handwritten note or email. So one of the key things is to, like I said, before actually finally wrapping it up, is have some key questions prepared for the interviewer. I'm going to talk through a couple of questions. One is, why is the position available? I think it's so important to know why the position's available. Is it a newly created position? Did someone get promoted? And then also, as some kind of sub questions to that is, how is performance measured for this role? What are the expectations in the first 90 days? The second question I always recommend asking is letting the interviewer know that you're interested in success stories. Ask how they got to where they were. And the reason this question is important is because it lets you know what they like best about the company, something that they may not have thought of when they were talking about, the company itself, the history, or the position. It's also good to ask about the long-term goals for the company. Are there opportunities for additional training and education? Also let you know about growth opportunities as well. Another one could be, what is your opinion of the current economy? Where do you feel the industry is headed? This gives you some insight of what the future of the company looks like, what their plans are, and it allows you to plan for your future as well. My favorite question, and sometimes a lot of people struggle with this one, is there anything that I've said today or in my background that concerns you? And the reason I like asking this questions and recommend individuals ask this question is it brings any objection to the forefront. And it allows you to address it so that you can note any issue that is raised and really be able to address that situation, whether it's about experience or whatever that skill set was that they might be addressing, that they were looking for maybe a greater level of exposure to. But it allows you to reassure them that you are a quick learner, that you can pick up the task, or maybe you already had experience in that area, but didn't happen to mention it in a previous conversation. So it allows you to address those things. And the last question, of course, is, I would really like to work here. What are the next steps? So you're reassuring them again. So it's not really, it is a question, but it's reassuring them again that you are interested in the role and finding out what you need to do, whether it's in a second interview or a third interview, or in some cases, you might have to do a presentation. So it lets them know in what timeline is involved as well when they're looking to make that decision. So, as far as interest in summary statements, you want to be prepared to make sure you discuss how your skills match the job description. And again, keeping your answers concise and relevant. I recommend printing out the job description and creating little bullet points for yourself before the interview so that you have it to reference during the interview. I always called it the why me sheet. So for every job responsibility, I wrote a quick example of a time I had to do that, whether it was while I was in school, in a different role, whatever the company was and what the position was, so that I could easily talk to it and didn't have to hesitate and think about, when did I do that? So having those relevant examples makes you also a lot more confident when you're delivering your answer to the question. And it allows you to keep focused on how you can help the company and the organization. And then, of course, following up after the interview, it's always important to send a thank you note or email. A handwritten follow, after a job interview, like I said, that first follow-up should be a thank you note, preferably in handwriting. But in this day and age, when in the interest of time, a lot of people, send them via email, which is absolutely acceptable. What most people don't realize is 75% of employers expect a thank you note or a thank you email, but only 36% of candidates actually send one. And this can truly make you stand out to a prospective employer. and it can be the deciding factor between you and another candidate. You also, like I said, you want to be brief in your thank you note, friendly and conversational, restate the interest, making sure that you provide any significant information that was provided that maybe you forgot to include during your conversation in the interview. I think we've all left an interview and said, oh, I wish I would have said this or reminded to talk about that. The thank you note or thank you email is a great place to, again, reiterate a skill or why you're interested. And just making sure that, and it is okay to check in. A lot of times people get nervous about checking in or thinking that, oh, well, maybe they think I'm too eager or they won't take my call. You don't want to assume you didn't get the job if you didn't get a call right away. Things happen in companies. So it's okay if, it's why it's so important to get that deadline of when they're looking to make a decision or when the next step is going to be taking place. And then you can call and follow up and let them know that, I remember we had our conversation and you'd mentioned that you were interested in making a decision this week. I'm eager to hear if you have an update or have made a decision at this time. And please let me know if there's anything that, I can provide you to assist in the decision-making process. So it's always good to, like I said, it's that extra step. It shows follow through and determination. You're showing so many skills before you're even in the door. And that is actually going to wrap up my presentation and bring us to questions.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Ready to open it up to any questions that anyone might have, any clarification.
I have a question about, I guess like during the interview, how important is like education level? Is that like considered like with a person with a bachelor's degree be like overlooked by someone with a master's degree, even though they have the same like qualifications? Like, does that play a huge factor in the interview process, or does it just basically depend on how the interview goes?
That is an excellent question. I think there are a couple of factors to look at. Is the first and foremost, the type of position. There are different like you'll see job requirements, you'll see preferred requirements. I think there's a lot of times too, where depending on the level of the position, there are times where I've personally have had people interview or submit their resumes and they've had varying levels of experience. Some people had, for example, an associate's degree, but had a couple of years of experience under their belt. I've had candidates that have had, just solely have a degree without the work experience. And it's really dependent on the position and how well the interview is going. I do believe a lot of employers value experience. They value a good work ethic and attitude because you can train skills. There are times too where, depending on the role, when you're taking a look, if somebody's overqualified, they may not even be called in for the interview as well. So if someone is overeducated for the position, that can actually be a deterrent for that person to being pulled in for the interview. But most employers really like a good combination of both skill, from an experience perspective, as well as the education, the academic experience. There's a lot of value to both. So I do think it's like, if you can bond with that employer and really show your value, if you have a bachelor's degree and someone else has a master's degree, the education at that point is not as critical unless it was a job requirement. So sometimes they say preferred experience, but that doesn't mean that that's the candidate that they're going to select, because you have to have the right fit into their culture. Like I said, the right, and culture is a big thing for a lot of companies these days, and if it's not a good cultural fit, then, the amount of education then becomes irrelevant. Great question.
Based on that, like, how do you like demonstrate that you are a good cultural fit?
Okay. Well, and that's where having done the research about the company comes into play. There's a lot of times where you can take a look to see on, for example, Glassdoor. Employees can list reviews of these, of their current position of the company. I always tell people to take those with a grain of salt, because you'll see more people complaining than praising. And unfortunately, that's the nature of the beast. But it can what you can see and look at when you're looking at those type of things is how old like if it's a complaint, for example, how old the complaint is. For example, if someone's complaining about leadership and it's 5 years old, the leadership could have changed at that point. It's also good to, if you have a LinkedIn profile, to search the company there and look for employees of that company. There are a lot of times if you reach out to them and say, I'm very interested in your company, I would love to, if you take a few minutes of your time. Do you mind if we set up, 5-minute, Zoom meeting or a face-to-face coffee meeting, whatever the case might be, to discuss the company or how you got into your role. People love talking about themselves, their companies, especially if they love their job. They can let you know by talking to someone who currently works there. And if you happen to know a friend or family member that works there as well, that's always a good in as well. But if you don't know someone there, leveraging LinkedIn is a great tool to be able to identify who works there, what their roles are, and they can really give you insight into what they do, how the company's grown in the amount of time they've been there, or the changes they've seen, because all companies go through changes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions? These are excellent questions, by the way.
Not that I can think of. I think those are two big ones, but yeah, thank you for answering those.
Yeah, no problem.
Anything else anyone wants to add or ask before we wrap up the recording for this session?
Now, Lisa anticipated my question and already answered it. So good job, Lisa. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so thank you for joining us for this session, everyone, and we will end the recording.